All right, I have introduced you to utilitarianism, and then we considered some problems for utilitarianism. But I do want you to read uh, Mill, sort of the name, big name in utilitarianism. And um, the Rachel's textbook is good and covers everything clearly, but I would feel like I'd failed if you didn't read some of the original stuff, right? This is that. I tried to keep it relatively short. Sometimes the language is a little more archaic, but it's relatively clear, I think. So Mill, in his article, um, he covers a few different points, and he covers different points than we've covered already in lecture, because some of the biggest issues that people are arguing about in his time, now by our time, are not like the biggest issues in utilitarianism necessarily, right? So first, he wants to dispel a few misconceptions about what the word utility means, right? So sometimes when we say something is utilitarian, we mean it's like super practical and sort of no frills, like utilitarian clothes or something would just be very plain but have lots of pockets, something like that. Um, it can even mean like the opposite of pleasure, right? So you might say that eating a protein shake instead of something delicious is like a utilitarian sort of meal. Um, and Mill just wants to be clear that sure, I mean, some people use the term that way, but that's not how he means it. When he says utility, he means pleasure and the absence of pain. There's a couple super important passages that come pretty early in this article, so I just want to point them out. They're sort of long quotes, but I'll just read them. So first, the first important passage I want you to find is that where Mill defines utilitarianism, right? And he defines it as the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Right? So greatest happiness principle is, the claim that you should do the action that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people, right? Um, and he explains here, right, that by utility he means happiness, and by happiness he means pleasure. And then he offers a very brief argument for utilitarianism, right? One which I've tried to expand in the first lecture a bit, but here's Mill saying it. The theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded. This is this is sort of a sentence fragment, but this is the what is the right? What grounds his theory of morality? Here, namely that pleasure and the freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, right? And that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in the other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So here he's saying the only thing that's good in itself, the thing, right, that we pursue is pleasure and the absence of pain. And again, I covered this before, right? Remember we went through that long list of like, why should you take this road to get to school? Because you want to do, right? You want to get to your final on time. Why do you want to get to your final on time? So you get a good grade, so you get a job, right? So you have food and shelter and you're not in pain, right? Um, so that's what he's saying here. Pleasure is the only thing desirable as an end. It's the only thing in itself, right, that we aim for. All the other stuff we're aiming for something else, and at the end of that line, pleasure, avoidance. Okay, so that should be clear by now, but that's just Mill saying it, right? Here's the dopamine, right? If you think pleasure is just dopamine firing in your brain, then, right, the end of all morality, for everyone in the world, right? So a an objection that he sort of focuses on a great deal that we haven't considered yet, because it's not as much of a contemporary worry, is what we can call the Swine objection. So Mills, now he's talking about, contemporaries who say, who try to put down utilitarianism because they think that that sort of morality is, quote, a doctrine worthy only of swine. So it's not super clear, but it seems like, sorry, I'm having a bit of an allergy, sniffly. Um, the objection seems to be that, hey, look, even pigs can experience pleasure. Pleasure is sort of a kind of a base, sort of lower kind of thing that even a pig can enjoy, right? Um, so to base morality on pleasure is to somehow say that human morality is no better. It's equivalent to pig morality. Now, Mill's response is to say no. There's significant differences between the kinds of pleasures that humans can have and the kinds of pleasures that pigs can have, right? And utilitarianism, right, cares about these human pleasures as well, right? So, pigs can't enjoy art, pigs can't do philosophy. There's pleasure in that. And Mill says much greater pleasure than eating slop and rolling in mud. Now, that is one way to approach it, right? To say, no, 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 we're not like pigs. More contemporary utilitarians um, sort of bite the bullet on that one and say, sure, yeah, okay, I guess it's swine morality if you think that, yeah, pigs are worthy of moral consideration because they can feel pain and feel pleasure, right? And that might lead you to, right, animal rights and things like that. But that's not Mill's concern at the time, right? Mill is more concerned with saying, no, 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 there's humans are special in as far as the kinds of pleasures they can enjoy. So, what are these higher pleasures, right? So, I mean, we have examples, right? It makes sense. Enjoying great art, right? Enjoying doing philosophy. Um, but what makes them higher is an interesting question. Are they just the same sorts of pleasures as rolling in the mud? They're just more pleasurable, right? Um, Probably not, right? Because if that's what Mill means, then it's not clear that he's made an interesting distinction between them, right? So, um, it would make human and pig morality comparable. You just have to sort of stack up more pigs, right? So 1,000 pigs rolling in the mud then would be equal to a human being visiting the Louvre, right? It's just again, if the question is the difference between the higher and lower pleasures is just sheer amount of pleasure, right? You can stack up a whole lot of low pleasure and it'll end up being as good or better. Um, so Mill probably means the higher pleasures are like a different kind of pleasure that are just it's just incommensurable, right, with the lower pleasures, right? So it's not clear what that means, right? What are the two kinds of pleasures? How do you compare them? How are they different? How do you still do this utilitarian calculus? He has something to say about how you can sort of do the math, right? Even if he's not totally clear on what are the two kinds of pleasures, how they're distinguished. Um, but he does say that, look, Um, we can rank these pleasures because anyone that's acquainted with both, right? Anyone that's seen the Mona Lisa and eaten a Snickers bar or rolled in the mud, um, will agree that viewing the Mona Lisa is a higher pleasure. I think you'll get total unanimity on that, more or less. Um, and once you've seen the Mona Lisa, right, you would never prefer a Snickers bar. You would never prefer 1,000 Snickers bars to getting to see the Mona Lisa. Right? So these higher pleasures are just on another tier, and he thinks anyone who has experienced both will understand that. And then he has this quote: "It's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." Right. So just being capable of having these higher pleasures sort of ranks you above the happiest pig in the world. Right. You're still just being a human and having I guess, even the mere capability of having these pleasures, right? But not being able to satisfy them all ranks you above the pig. It's not even um, not totally clear, right? There's some gaps in the uh, explanation here. If you'd like to sort of fill them out in a paper, that's interesting. So um, maybe I'll pause here to say, there's different kinds of papers you can write, and sometimes the easiest paper is just someone makes an argument, you think it's wrong, you think you got some good reasons for why it's wrong, and you write that paper. That's way to do it perfectly good. You do it well, A paper. Um, it sometimes conceptually is a little harder for people to write a paper sort of agrees with something, right? I think utilitarian is onto something. I want to write a paper about how good it is, um, and there's sometimes a tendency to restate the reason. It's hard to find something original there. Here's one way to be original: is to sort of, if there's a theory you like, flesh it out. If there's vague, confusing parts, talk about why they're confusing, and then offer to sort of like clear it up. If you think you can explain a little better than Mill does in this essay, what it is for what it is about seeing the Mona Lisa, right? That's incomparable to a bar rolling in the mud, or even 1,000 or 1,000,000 Snickers bars. Um, Explain that, right? That's an original paper as well. Sort of helping out author that you like. That's a pretty good paper. Okay, so Mill sort of considers, he's trying to make this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, and he's saying, look, anyone who's experienced both is always going to choose the higher pleasure. It's just obvious that it's better, or at least they're going to agree that that pleasure is greater. And of course, he has to consider the fact that many people nonetheless choose the lower pleasures, right? Um, we often decide to just sleep in rather than get up and read our philosophy, right? Um, we often choose to eat whatever, the ice cream instead of the broccoli. Um, Mill says, yeah, of course, right? That's weakness of will. That's um, not a problem with utilitarianism. That's a problem with human psychology. Nonetheless, we all agree on what the greater pleasure is. We just also are sometimes, you know. And then Mill also thinks that if you're habitually choosing lower pleasures, you will sort of warp your mind or degrade your sensibilities to the point where you can't appreciate higher pleasures anymore. So if all you do is shoot heroin, you may lose the capability of appreciating the Mona Lisa, right? Um, but again, right, he doesn't say a lot about how these higher pleasures differ from lower pleasures, what makes them different, but what makes them both pleasures at the same time. Okay, so on to the greatest happiness principle. So again, you should be familiar with this at this point. Utilitarianism holds that what makes an action morally right is that produces the greatest net happiness for everyone in the world, right? Even on into the future. Um, Everyone includes all humans, all sentient creatures, right? So, um, and more, right? So contemporary utilitarians take sentient to include um, lots of animals, right? Anything capable of pleasure and pain. So this poodle here for sure, right? Um, Mill then considers the objection that maybe no human can ever truly be happy, right? So if happiness is impossible for humans, then it would seem that utilitarianism is a pointless exercise, right? It can't be an appropriate um, moral theory for humans if humans are just never happy. It might seem strange to object that humans could ever be truly happy. This may be in the background, sort of a Christian theology, right? Of like in this world, right? Until you go to heaven or something, you'll never be happy. I'm not quite sure. Um, and Mill says, well, I mean, what do you mean by happy here, right? If you're saying that no human will ever be in a state of constant ecstasy, right, for their entire lives, then yeah, you're right. Um, says, but I don't think utilitarianism requires that, right? It just means all those little moments of happiness, right? You're lying in the grass, looking at the butterflies, right? Um, that's happiness, right? That's human happiness. Perfectly good. Um, all of those are good, right? All the little pains, those are bad, and then just the point is to maximize the amount of happiness. So, given that definition, right, can you get by without sort of constant ecstasy? And Mill says, sure, of course. Many people in this world, right? But probably on net, most of us are fairly fortunate, and there's probably a couple billion people out there that with much less happiness than we do in their lives. very much a struggle for many people. He says all we're trying to do is set things up so we get them more. It would be relatively easy to get them a lot more happiness in their lives. So another objection he considers has to do with martyrdom, right? So if utilitarianism is right, you might say, why do we admire people who sacrifice their own pleasure, right? And in fact, sometimes those are like the greatest models of morality that we have, right? That Jesus, Buddha, Gandhi, these people that are totally ascetic, right? And forego all these pleasures, right, for something greater. Um, or just any person that sort of struggles and dies. Often people in the military are idolized for this reason, right? That dies or risks their lives and goes through hardship for the sake of others, right? If pleasure is so important, then why do we think of these people and their pain as sort of a model of, right, morality? Well, Mill says that there is pleasure involved, right? In all these cases, the martyr is struggling for someone else's pleasure, right? And that's fine. Utilitarianism says, yeah, you add up all the pleasure, right? Again, it's not just about your pleasure. Um, and that's why we admire these people. It's because they suffer so that the rest of us can enjoy greater pleasure. The net pleasure in the world is increased for, right, the Buddha having existed, Gandhi having existed, right? So the utilitarian says, yeah, of course, right? They're good. That's good to maximize happiness. You would never idolize someone who just suffers and dies for no reason, right? That doesn't make anyone happy. They just, right, they put themselves through tons of pain for no good reason, doesn't make anyone happy. No one would idolize that person, right? There's no inherent value in the suffering itself, only in the pleasure that it ultimately brings someone, right? So this objection I should be familiar from the last lecture, right? Utilitarianism might be interpreted as very demanding, right? It seems like you can't, right, spend money on a movie when that money would be better spent, would create more pleasure, saving someone on the other side of the world from starvation, right? Now, Mill's version of the objection is slightly different, right? And it asks, is it realistic that we are actually motivated by the happiness of everyone when we make every decision, right? Is this sort of a psychologically realistic sort of account of human moral motives? Um, and Mill says, no, yeah, of course not, right? Our motivations for our actions are not necessarily utilitarian all the time. That's fine, right? You don't necessarily have to always be thinking about the utilitarian calculus, as long as what you're doing doesn't conflict with the greatest happiness principle. Right? It's fine to do what you want. So he says, look, yeah, I mean, if you're trying, often your choices don't have a great moral weight, right? Either way, it's not going to cause a difference in pain or pleasure, right? So thinking about whether you should eat a burger or a taco, either one, it's up to you. Or eat this monstrosity up here, burger or taco. You don't have to worry about whether it's benefiting all of humanity. It's just not that weighty of a decision. It's not going to make a huge difference, right? And you don't have to worry about being motivated by that. And more generally, this worry about motivation is just not a utilitarian sort of thing. They just don't care about your motivation, right? They only care about the effects, the consequences. If you save a drowning child, but you're really doing it because you want to look good and impress people and you want them to think you're great, Mill says, fine, great, you've still done a good thing. The effects are good. It's a good action, right? Who cares about your motivation? Um, and he thinks most of the time, right, your moral decisions are going to be made on the basis of the consequences that you expect for a few people, right? If you were saving a child, and let's say you're not doing it out of vanity, right, but because you think you're doing it for the child, right? Maybe you're thinking about their family too. You're certainly not thinking about the net happiness of the whole world. Um, that's fine, right? You don't have to. Most of us, unless you're the president of the United States or something like that, you just don't have that kind of global influence, right? So your little action, it's more appropriate to think about the small circle of people who might benefit or not. Now, on this topic of motivations, um, there is a sort of a similar objection that says this whole notion of, right, doing the right thing or making moral choices on the basis of like this calculation, this kind of cold calculation of consequences is weird. It doesn't feel like morality, right? Moral actions should be based on moral feelings, right? Not on math. And again, Mill says that's just sort of um, superstition, right? Motivations are not relevant, right? Um, he thinks that just because a good person does something for good motives doesn't make it a good action. You can do something with the best intention and totally muck it up, right? And have bad results. And he thinks, and this is probably controversial, even if you did something with good intentions, if it had bad consequences, it was a bad thing, right? You shouldn't have done it. Now we might like it when people have moral feelings, right? But it doesn't bear on the morality of their actions for Mill. And he's doing a little of biting the bullet here, right? You might disagree, and I think our intuitions probably disagree on this point, right? If I'm trying to save you from, I don't know, falling in a well, and then I accidentally break your arm or something, and it turns out you wouldn't have fallen in the well anyways. Usually, you wouldn't blame me, right, and say I was a bad person trying to do the good thing. But Mill would disagree with you there. Right, and that's what I say here. Yeah, if I try to jump in front of a bullet for you, but in the end I actually end up deflecting it and deflecting it towards your heart, and it ends up killing you, right? Did I do wrong? Mill says yes, bad consequences. Um, so other people might disagree, right? You wouldn't be blamed for trying to do the right thing. Here's a significant sort of, I guess, biting the bullet for utilitarians. Okay, on to the last couple slides here. This will be relatively short. Another objection, and you'll notice, right, the bulk of this essay is considering objections, and that's a good tip for your essays, right? If you find that feel you've made your argument and you're like only 2 pages in and you got to fill 2 pages, objections. That's the best way to pad out a paper, right? Um, okay, so some people, particularly during Mill's time, right? This is a couple hundred years ago. Well, not quite 200, but in the late 1800s. Um, right? They may have noticed, hey, you haven't mentioned God, right? You've been talking about happiness and pleasure. Um, Isn't God important? Shouldn't God feature in a theory of morality? And Mill just says, hey, look, I don't mention God, right? But it's not incompatible with religion, right? Um, Particularly if you assume that one of God's primary goals is for us to be happy, right? Um, we do have to figure out the will of God somehow, right? And again, assuming that God wants us to be happy, maybe the greatest happiness principle is a plausible way of figuring out God's will, right? All right. Now, here's a common objection. It's one I often get in student essays, right? So I want to point out here that it has been addressed by Mill. And so if you want to write about this, you have to consider Mill's response, right? And go a little deeper, right? Something that Mill didn't respond to. But the worry is, wouldn't it just be impossible to perform, right, the kind of calculations that utilitarianism requires for every single action, right? Everything I do, to think about all the actions of all the consequences for all of humanity for the rest of time. It's literally impossible, right? Because it's infinite, you know, and even if not infinite, it's certainly impractical, right? So if I drive to work today, okay, well, I should calculate the potential harm of my carbon emissions, right? What's the probability of my getting into an accident and harming someone? Um, and then I have to weigh that against, well, my boss will be unhappy if I don't show up, right? And then me and my family will be unhappy if I don't get paid, and so on. And you're doing this every time you get up in the morning, decide to drive to work. Um, yeah, obviously that's not how morality should work, right? That is too much. Um, and again, like if you're trying to calculate the consequences farther and farther into the future, right? We're literally talking about infinity, and it gets more and more unpredictable. How do I can I predict with any accuracy the effect of my driving to work 100 years? Who knows, right? The butterfly effect sort of thing. Anything could happen, right? So Mill says, yeah, you don't have to do that, right? Um, we have a lot of help, right? In that there are all the previous generations before us, right? All of human history, right? Thousands and thousands of years where people have experience about what the consequences of certain types of actions end up being, right? And these end up being sort of like crystallized in the traditional rules of morality, right? It's no coincidence that there's sort of a rule that says, hey, don't kill people. Why? Because over thousands of years, humans realized killing people ends up having more bad consequences than good, right? It ends up causing more pain than pleasure. Don't lie, don't steal, and so on, right? So Mill's saying the traditional moral rules are actually good because they have a utilitarian basis, right? And people have over the years figured out that, oh, these have bad consequences. We should make rules against them, right? So you can, in your everyday life, just follow the rules your parents taught you, right? Um, that will get you the good consequences. You don't have to do the math every time. But the math is there, right? If you're ever in a tricky spot, it can help, right? All right, and finally, flexibility, right? We've talked about this as well. This is one of the great things about utilitarianism, right? Seems like every rule has an exception, right? So moral rules have run into problems with those exceptions, and utilitarianism doesn't have that problem at all, right? Um, because it leaves it open for every action that's evaluated on its consequences, right? Um, So it doesn't have to make any of these ad hoc exceptions, right? It's wrong to kill, except in self-defense, or except in certain rewards, right? So on. It just says, yeah, do the math, right? Is it going to make more happiness? Then kill, right? If not, then don't kill. Um, so that is the Mill paper, and I do encourage you to read it, right? And this lecture will just to sort of like clear it up. Maybe after watching this lecture, try to read it again, right? Be great to throw some Mill quotes in your paper if you're writing on utilitarianism. And so that is it for utilitarianism. And next week we will move into deontology and Cont.